Okay, so today is the second tutorial of the Anime Node Basics series. Today we are going to be speaking about the gradient node. So let's get started. Today we are going to be speaking about the gradient node. This is also one of the most important nodes in my opinion, and you would use this one in tandem with a MixRGB, either on multiply or on add. So this is what we are going to speak about today. We are going to speak about using the gradient node on places where we want to add permanent gradient of shadow on an object or a permanent gradient of light on an object. Alright, so I have a nice scene over here. First we are going to speak about adding some light behind the wall, because as you can see it's kind of a sunset setting. I would need kind of a halo effect behind this wall. So we are going to use a gradient texture. We are going to bring first a shader to RGB in front of the BSDF so that I can place a MixRGB in front of that BSDF. Note that a shader to RGB, we are going to discuss this in a later tutorial, the pros and cons of this node as well as other nodes. But for now, I'm just going to suffice. We are going to bring in a shader to RGB, and then we are going to bring in a MixRGB and set that to either add, overlay or soft light, whichever one works best for you and whichever one works best for your scene. And then all you need now is to bring a gradient node. Press Ctrl T for the gradient node and add a color. Ctrl T normally works if you have Node Wrangler add-on enabled. So if you don't have that enabled, you just need to go to Edit Preferences and enable the Node Wrangler add-on. But once you've done that, we can just view this gradient node and we can rotate it to the back of the mesh. So I'm going to rotate it on the Y and Z a bit and then move it around with the X coordinates so that it just appears on the edge of the model. And then we can play around with the color ramp, and there we go, we have our nice light outline on our mesh, and we can play around with the color on the MixRGB. And now moving on to adding permanent shadow onto the walls. You can see the walls are pretty flat shaded, not a big problem, but we want to add some more depth. So the way we can achieve this is we come to the shader here, and then in front of this basic node 3 we have over here of the image and the MixRGB, we are going to bring in another MixRGB set to multiply. This is how we are going to add permanent shadow to our wall. Then we bring in a gradient and we press Ctrl T with the gradient. After bringing in the gradient, we just need now a color ramp. This color ramp will help us influence where the shadow lies. And then all we need to do now is we need to play with the mapping node behind the gradient, rotate it on the y-axis 90, and then we are just going to move it around until we are happy with it. Then it's plugged into the MixRGB, it's set to multiply, and then we can view it through the BSDF and play around with the factor. And see now, simply, we have added a permanent shadow to our model, and now it has some more depth, and we can just copy and paste this node 3 throughout our shaders. Another way you can use the gradient texture is to use it as a sphere. So as you can see on this reference, it's not very high quality, but it suffices. You can see the light gets dimmer as it goes off, and the center point of the light is where the light is most intense. So if you want to make this effect, it's pretty easy. So bring in a gradient texture and set that gradient texture to quadratic sphere. And this will work if your origin of your mesh is in the center, because when we Ctrl T it, we are going to set that mode to object, and if your origin is not in the center of the object, you are going to have to play with some of the coordinates on the X or Y so that it appears in the middle, in the center. But for me it's in the center because I have my origin in the center of the mesh. Once you do that, you just plug it in to the emission, and there you already have the dark outlines and the center point is intense with light. You could now assign colors to the color ramp and whatever, but the easiest way for me is you just add another MixRGB behind the emission, and then you set that to multiply and plug that color ramp into the bottom socket so that we can influence the color that we choose on the MixRGB with this multiply. And now as you can see, the more you drag up the factor node, the more dark it gets, or the lower it gets lighter, but you get that center point of intense light and the outline is darker. And that's another way you can use the gradient node. Alright, that's it for this tutorial. Hope you learned something and hope you benefited. See you in the next one, where we talk about the color ramp and the different things you can do with it. Alright, bye.